that Rachel Reeves is going on spending. So we had that leaked memo last week whereby you basically had Angela Rayner suggesting other ways of moving forward as a government, so putting up some taxes on the middle classes, perhaps some withdrawal of middle class benefits. So I won't say too much because obviously you have to listen to the podcast and subscribe via your podcast provider. But the other dimension, of course, that we're seeing at the moment is so Rachel Reeves is losing authority in the way that Steve Richards describes. You know, she wasn't there when the announcement last week was made on the winter fuel allowance. But is Rachel Reeves the real culprit of this government, or actually is it Morgan McSweeney, the chief advisor to the Prime Minister? Because this government is incredibly unpopular, but Morgan Sweeney is somehow seen as this sort of Svengalian, this great guru. But actually, isn't he partly the architect of why Labour's in trouble? And of course, the other difference we've seen is not just potentially Angela Rayner and Rachel Reeves or Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. It's between Morgan McSweeney and the Prime Minister on the issue of whether to maintain the two-child cap.
Yes.
So I wonder whether Keir Starmer is at an interesting juncture in his government when he's beginning to ask some really tough questions, because he basically gave economic policy over to Rachel Reeves. She really ran economic policy. He's had his political tactics set by Morgan McSweeney.
Yes.
And as we look at this government, perhaps it's become more unpopular, it's become more unpopular more quickly than any new government in modern times.
Yeah.
And maybe Keir Starmer isn't just the fault himself, but he's looking at his chief tactical advisor, his chief of staff in Downing Street, and his chancellor, and asking some tough questions of them.
Yeah.
So I think we're in an interesting moment in this government's trajectory.
That is interesting. I can easily well believe that most of the cabinet are willing to say they're not very happy with Rachel Reeves. Apart from anything else, we're very, very close to a public spending review. And there are going to be no great winners in that. It's just about who is hurt the most. And those who are in unprotected departments are going to really suffer some pain. They don't have enough money, they feel, at the moment. They're seeing Rachel Reeves sticking to these fiscal rules. Many of them think, why are we even doing that? So I can see where that stuff emanates from.
Oh, that's where it's absolutely all coming from. And I mustn't steal all of Steve's thunder, which I'm partly doing. Sorry, Steve, if you're listening. He does listen to Pienaar Friends. Is that the other issue, of course, is that the child poverty review has been delayed because the people writing the child poverty review do not see progress being made on child poverty if this benefit cap isn't lifted. But nearly every other department has similar arguments. They say it's impossible for us to achieve what you asked us to, Prime Minister, Chancellor, if we're going to have to make big spending cuts. So, as always, there's lots of things that excite us in politics, but it is often the bread and butter of how much departments get to spend, how much tax there is, that actually determines the fate of governments. And I think we're at an interesting stage in this government's life.
Yeah, I do want to come back in a moment to that point you made about public popularity, because there's a few riders or just additions that are worth adding to what you said there. Rachel, I mean, before you tell us your thought for the day, you're very close to these conversations, and as I say, we can all easily imagine these conversations are moan here and mutter there, going on around this sort of the pillars and corridors of the House of Commons. How far do you think it is about that sort of spending review time? It's never going to be easy. Now it's going to be tougher than most other occasions when there's spending review. And how far is it a fundamental argument about philosophy and the identity of the party, do you think?
I think things add up, and often in political narratives you're looking for the moment and you go, this was the turning point, but actually more often than not it is the build-up, it's the drip of things that backbench MPs or indeed ministers have to stomach, where they go, it's okay, we don't want to do this, but it's for the greater good, we'll be able to do X down the line, so we'll take the pain now. And those things add up, and we can do a whole list of the things that have been adding up, from two-child benefit cap, winter fuel allowance, the row over inheritance tax changes, but more recently, some of the comments made about migration, some of the comments made about sort of whether migration has been, or was it an incalculable damage to the UK, was a phrase that Keir Starmer used. And a lot of Labour MPs, that's not language that they feel comfortable with. So it's things that are adding up, which are much, much more palatable when you can see that you are doing well, when you are winning elections, or when the polls are in your favour. When you're having to stomach all of this and you are not winning elections and the polls are very much not in your favour, even if that is masked to some extent by what's going on in the Conservative Party, it's very difficult to get people back on track without offering them something. And we've seen a hint towards the something, which is tweaks to the winter fuel allowance. I think they're going to have a real struggle with how to make changes to it that are not reintroducing it in full as a universal benefit, but that do enough to alleviate some of the damage. And you've also, now that sort of crack has opened up, you've got a whole lot of MPs and a whole lot of ministers in different departments going, OK, but my department needs money, or we need money for this cause, or whatever. So I think that Tim is absolutely right that the anger being aimed at Rachel Reeves is very real, in part because it looks like her strategy isn't paying off. And if it were paying off, the conversation would be different.
So I think, don't you reckon, in a curious way, this is where having a majority in the House of Commons bigger than the Great Wall of China has a negative effect. It kettles in resentment. People go in on a wave of 400 MPs or whatever it is, and suddenly they're suffering, very quickly suffering. They think, it wasn't meant to be like this. We want a stonking majority, and look at what we're going through.
Well, and you've also got more people to try and keep happy. So if you think about what the whips generally have to do, benefit cuts, I didn't even get to sort of mentioning benefit cuts and disability benefits, but what the whips have to do is you've got 400 odd MPs. Some of them are in government, you pretty much count on those ones to vote along the party line. But the rest of them, you've got to offer them things, and you've got to work out what are their key issues and what are things that they're really upset about, and what you can trade. And if you have so many of them, you have whips spread very, very thin, the limit to how much carrots you have on offer.
And I think two other special factors which add up to what you just said, John, is that, yes, they've got a majority of bigger than the Great Wall of China, but individually they have quite small majorities because they only got elected on 34%, and they're also very new to Parliament. And there isn't that sort of, one of the things I most regret about the current Parliament is that there aren't enough people who've been there for around the block a few times who can steady the nerves of new MPs. But you have a lot of Labour MPs new to Parliament with thin majorities, and that isn't necessarily a good mix if you're the Prime Minister. All addressed on the Not Another One podcast.
You really should charge him.
I know, you're going to get an invoice. Rachel, what is your thought for the day?
I was thinking about the Conservative Party and the mess that they're in, and how differently things could have gone in November with a different leader. It's widely assumed now that Robert Jenrick is sort of leader in waiting for a chance to take over. I'm really interested in what's happened to the... Do they have a name? The Cleverleyites? The Cleverley? No, that doesn't really work, does it? Cleverleyites. It's quite a bit of a mouthful. And obviously James Cleverley never got the chance to run in the runoff because of some vote swapping shenanigans that didn't work out in his favour. And an interesting thing to think about would be, of the current Conservative membership, which we don't know how many there are because they're not publishing numbers, but how many of them have gone to Reform? Would it be different now? Do you have more of those one nation centrist Cameroon types? I'm not sure James Cleverley would call himself a Cameroon, but leaving that to one side. Or has the party shifted? Because the rhetoric of the party has shifted rightwards, but has the membership, given that those who would like a more Reform-style policy platform might well have gone to Reform? And we're just not going to know the answer to that until we have a leadership contest, but I think it's all going to be very messy.
I suppose there are rival attractions if you're not happy with the Tories, just as there are for the Labour Party.
I think Rachel says something really just important, actually, because I think people have underestimated the extent to which the Tory membership has changed because of the rise of Reform. And actually, the idea that Jenrick would automatically win a leadership election, I think, may actually be not true.
Yes.
So we need one of those Home surveys that occasionally pop up.
Yes, yeah. Would you bet at this stage? I mean, I know it's a daft mugs bet, but would you?
You just told me it's a daft game and you're asking me to do it anyway.
Well, just knowing that.
I think it will actually be incredibly close now between Cleverley and Jenrick. I think Jenrick probably has momentum with him because people have seen him perform well as Shadow Justice. But I think the point Rachel makes, the membership may have changed quite a lot. And not in Jenrick's favour.
What should we call the Cleverleyites? I don't know. Clever dicks. Doesn't quite work, does it? We're going to move on. We've got a lot to talk to in a limited amount of time. You're listening to Pienaar Friends on Times Radio.
Weekday afternoons on
And here with me on Pienaar Friends, Tim Montgomerie and Rachel Cunliffe. Just a word from thought from both of you on King Charles, which I thought was a really interesting speech. In some ways, I was surprised, within the boundaries of protocol, diplomacy, and so on. He was quite direct in addressing, the biggest challenge facing Canada. Now, this was a speech that was written, sure, by the office of the Canadian Prime Minister, the Canadian government. That would have been in there. But I don't for a moment imagine he found what he had to say was given to say uncomfortable. Let's just have a listen back.
Today, Canada faces another critical moment. Democracy, pluralism, the rule of law, self-determination, and freedom are values which Canadians hold dear and ones which the government is determined to protect. The system of open global trade that, while not perfect, has helped to deliver prosperity for Canadians for decades, is changing. Canada's relationships with partners are also changing.
So, global trade, self-determination, the rule of law, changing relationships. Nothing improper there for a king to say on the throne at a state opening of one of the king's parliaments. But we knew exactly what he meant by that. I'm sure he was happy to say it, and they were certainly happy to hear it. I almost felt like joining in the round of applause, guys. What did you think of it, Tim?
No, of course, this is the first time, I think, reigning monarch has attended the throne speech, as they call it, for 30, 40 years.
For 50 years.
For 50 years. So that in itself was a signal itself. And I think it was Ian Martin, my colleague, pointed out that he was on a battleship recently and King Charles wore his Canada medals.
Yes, that's
so
right.
He's already been sort of making pretty clear, and he made it even clearer today. So Donald Trump doesn't necessarily pick up on subtlety, does he? So and King Charles has been anything less than subtle, even in raw terms. So maybe the message has been got through to the White House. We'll see.
Yeah. Rachel, what do you think?
He quoted the Canadian national anthem, didn't he? He said, the true North is indeed strong and free. It was quite fighting stuff. And I'm actually quite interested in how this plays here at home, because both the Conservatives and Reform have tried to position themselves as closer to Donald Trump perhaps than Labour.
Not so much recently.
No, that's not really. Kenny Badenoch certainly tried. But I think there's an interesting question here of sort of patriotism, because King Charles is also the head of state in Canada, and we know that. We all know that, but getting a very visual, very emotive symbol of that, I think it and I'm not saying that were Donald Trump to order US troops to go and annex Canada to become the 51st state of America, we would be sending in troops to protect them. I don't think those conversations are happening. Maybe they are happening, actually. Who knows? But I do think it's sort of a reminder of the history, of the fact that it's all a little bit more complicated than it's a lovely straight line on a map. Wouldn't it be nice if the two countries merged? And I don't think that you can be patriotic and British without having quite an emotional response to seeing the King of United Kingdom and there in Canada with that message on the world stage.
Yes, I mean. Agree. I mean, felt the same way. I mean, it is also true in the real world, which we all actually live. Although sometimes in the studio, you wonder about that. But we are living in the real world. There's no reality in which, well, maybe there is in some parallel universe, but not in ours, where the American can do anything by force or by serious coercion to take possession of Canada. It's just not remotely a possibility, and yet this sort of atmosphere of hostility and resentment has reached an extraordinary pitch. A number of Canadian politicians I've been speaking to in recent days and weeks who tell me exactly that, something that would have been unimaginable to them not so very long ago, and yet here we are. Trump, in his meeting with Carney in the White House just a couple of weeks ago, he pretty much accepted it, didn't he? I mean, his phrase was, takes two to tango, which is as near as you're going to get from Donald Trump to an admission of reality. You can't just decide to take possession of Canada. He wouldn't say it about Greenland, by the way, but he did say it about Canada.
But I wonder how serious he was about Canada in the first place.
Sure.
And he just, I think, maybe he didn't. I love America, but it is quite an insular country in lots of ways. And I don't think sometimes they don't really follow foreign news as intensively as we follow their news, for example. And I just wonder if Donald Trump in particular just completely underestimates how much the world listens to what he says. And maybe he doesn't maybe he does think the world pays all attention, but he's talked about Canada with seemingly any real, because he was still doing it on election day.
Yeah.
He was still talking about Canada in a way that absolutely changed the Canadian election.
Yes.
I wonder if he realised when he set out on that path how profound the consequences would be.
Yeah.
Do you think most Americans, I don't know the answer to this, I'd be really interested to find out, most Americans know that King Charles is the head of state in Canada?
They probably think King Charles is the king of most of the world. I don't know.
But not of America, crucially.
Not of America, no. They probably like him to be king of America.
What are you suggesting, that we annex the United States of America?
Make America Great Britain again.
Okay, you heard it here first.
Yeah, well, of this our Reform UK policy is born. So we were here. We can say we were there. And speaking of reform, you were both there today.
Yes.
At Westminster, watching Nigel Farage and company launching this policy push to, if you like, just wheel a tank onto a Labour lawn, be gentler on welfare reform than Labour are being just at the moment. This was Farage earlier on, having a go at Labour, saying his party would scrap the 2-child benefit cap.
We built this party around 3 key principles, things that we think need to be fought for and defended, things that we think most people in this country hold the dearest in their hearts. And that is, of course, family, community and country. And that is why we believe lifting the 2-child cap is the right thing to do.
So Nigel Farage there, almost lyrical. He didn't actually say we built this city on rock and roll, but it was meant to sort of get your toes tapping. Although Stuart Adam from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, he wasn't over impressed.
There were really big tax cuts promised there. Reform want to match that with really big spending cuts. As is always tempting, we've had much more specifics, much more detail about what are the tax cuts and benefit increases than about how we would how they would pay for them.
Yeah.
They talk about making efficiencies by cutting money from quangos. Well, okay, but how much funding would you cut from which quangos and what would they stop doing? Spending cuts on that scale cannot just be cutting waste and improving efficiencies. To raise that amount of money.
So not only do the numbers not add up, there aren't enough numbers to add up. And interestingly, you, Tim, earlier on air, were pretty much admitting as such.
Well, first of all, Rachel can agree or disagree with this, because we were just sat 2 seats away from each other this morning without realising at the time. Nigel Farage was brilliant today in setting out the nature of the dramatic change in our political scenery. I don't know whether you agree, Rachel, but that first passage part of his speech in identifying that something is changing in our politics was quite dramatic and brilliantly done. He's a very good observer of politics, and that was a strong part of his speech. I love the fact that he's emphasising the family, which I think is the most important unit in society, and he wants to support that. But, coming to your question, eventually, John, I think this country could well have a major fiscal crisis in the next few years. You're already seeing quite a bit of uncertainty in the bond markets. What you do not, if reform are to come close to winning power, it will be in the context of not just Conservative economic failure in the last government, but of Labour economic failure as well. Not just the voters or questioners like you, journalists like you, John, but the bond markets. I want to kick the tyres of any prospective government. And it isn't going to be good enough for reform to be as sketchy as they currently are closer to the election. But we aren't that close to the election now. So I think reform have time to get it right. But they need to. And at the moment, it doesn't add up. I think it will need to, and it will add up, insofar as I have any influence at all, closer to the election. And there were hints there. There weren't just... Nigel Farage didn't just give easy answers to all of the questions. I think it was Bloomberg who asked about the triple lock, the guarantee for pensioners, about which is one of the most expensive commitments by political parties in Britain at the moment. And he refused to say that Reform would honour that. He said that was something they would return to later in the Parliament. So there will be time for the numbers to add up, and they must add up. But it's certainly fair to say they don't. There aren't enough pieces in the jigsaw at the moment for the complete picture that all of us need.
Yeah, I mean, Rachel, you were 2 seats away and about a mile apart. What did you make of? What did you make of what you heard?
He's a very powerful, emotive speaker, and I think anyone watching British politics who wonders how it is that Reform have made such astonishing gains in the space of less than a year should go and watch a Nigel Farage speech. You really do get a sense in person of that he is different to most politicians. His sort of abilities to capture a narrative and connect with a crowd, like regardless of your political views. Look, the numbers don't add up. I think the Liberal Democrats have come out with a statement saying it's trustonomics on steroids, I think is their phrase. We're talking billions, we're talking tens of billions, we're talking 200 billion found down the back of the Treasury sofa by just cuts and quangos. None of it adds up. The telling bit for me was when Farage was asked about it not adding up. One, he had a whole list of a whole list of facts and figures ready, and he put his glasses on to read out those facts and figures. I'm serious. I've done the maths.
I noticed that as well.
Yeah, putting his glasses on. Nice bit of showmanship there. But basically, what he said was, "Okay, our numbers don't." I'm paraphrasing here. This is not a direct quote, but our numbers may not completely add up. But the Conservative numbers didn't add up. Labour's numbers don't add up. The national debt is already, in the trillions. Who cares? And I think that is going to be a really interesting question as to whether Conservatives and Labour and the Lib Dems can make this point about fantasy economics stick, or whether we're fudging it but everyone fudges it, give us a go message really can get through. And I was really interested in that dynamic watching today, because I just don't know the answer to that.
Yes.
People are terrified of another Truss, another Liz Truss moment, but I'm not sure they associate Trussonomics with Nigel Farage, even though the numbers involved are in the billions.
Yeah, they're simply not being judged as an alternative government at the moment. It's just not what's happening. I mean, we look at the opinion polls. Earlier on, you made the point in your thought for the day about the government's vertiginous drop in popularity since coming into office. And certainly Labour did itself no favours. A lot of the decisions were badly judged, badly communicated, and all of those things are true. Maybe we should also focus on the fact that the biggest change that happened since Labour moved from opposition into government was that they moved from opposition into government. And suddenly the heavy weight, a ton of pig iron hanging round a government's neck, weighed round Labour's neck. The burden of incumbency in this age, in this country, and everywhere else just now is absolutely crushing. And we're seeing that now. And there's some numbers out there today, YouGov polls, which put, almost encouragingly for the Reform UK party, they are 11 points ahead of Labour, stretching their lead. But the same pollster, the same survey, tells that in the choice of who would be the best leader of the country, well, then Farage is 15 points behind Keir Starmer, who is well out in front, which supports the idea. What we're seeing is a dramatic example of early midterm protest, and we should see it in that light.
I think the poll is really interesting, the head-to-head one, because not only is Keir Starmer at 15 points ahead, Kemi Badenoch, who is being pretty useless, she's 4 points ahead as well. So I think this is a symptom of our sort of fracturing politics, that Reform might be the most popular party in terms of opinion polls, but they're in the 30s. But when you come to a binary choice, okay, but who would you want in Downing Street, the anti-Reform sentiment is stronger than the Reform sentiment.
Right. Good thought. Lots to talk about still, and we've got half an hour left. We're going to be joined by Molly Ball, one of our favourite American colleagues from the Wall Street Journal, right after the news. The news which comes now here on Pienaar Friends with Laura Cook.
The McSpicy Franks.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker, this is Times Radio.
And here with me on Pienaar and Friends, we've got Tim Montgomerie, we've got Rachel Cunliffe from the Statesman, and we are joined by Carolyn Quinn, who is in for Kate Borsay tonight. The incomparable Carolyn Quinn is with us in the studio.
John, hello everyone.
Hello.
Well, you've been talking a lot about Nigel Farage, haven't you, in that speech today? He was saying that Reform UK is the party of working people and the family, more encouragement for marriage and children. The winter fuel allowance would be reinstated for all pensioners. Although, interestingly, no commitment from him was there on whether the triple lock would continue under a Reform government. Anyway, we will be picking through those figures with Simon French.
They're not going to dump the triple lock, are they? Their voters are, they're older than me, and that's saying something.
Well, also, I mean, the thing about the triple lock, I suppose, is that is a big funding commitment. And already in the speech today, he's pledging an awful lot of money.
Yeah.
And as he kept saying, you're going to ask me, aren't you, how are you going to fund this? And I will tell you. But when he told us, we're all saying yes, but it still doesn't quite add up. So anyway, Simon French, who's a chief economist at Pamela Gordon and happens to be a Times columnist as well, and a former economic advisor in the UK civil service, he's running his slide rule along some of these figures and telling us what he thinks. And I'm also going to be joined by Vince Cable, former Lib Dem leader, former Business and Trade Secretary, to see what he thinks of it. I don't know about you, John, but when Nigel Farage said that Keir Starmer doesn't know what it's like to get up at 5 a.m. in the morning and go out to work, and I suddenly had a recollection of George Osborne saying, when he was bringing in the welfare curbs, that, the hard-working person who gets up in the morning, goes out in the dark and sees his neighbour still asleep with the curtains drawn, and that neighbour is on benefit. So it just sort of...
Nick Clegg did it as well. I think he talked about Alarm Clock Britain, didn't it? I'm pretty sure. So
these
what do you
things...
ask Vince Cable about China as well? Because he got quite close to China, I think, over recent years as well.
Okay.
So tease me a bit on that if you get a chance, Carolyn.
TBC. And also Fiona Hamilton, who's the chief reporter for The Times, will be talking us through everything we know that happened in Liverpool last night, the police response, and also why they were so quick to describe that suspect as a white British man.
It's not a mystery, that, is it?
Well, you just didn't want the sort of misinformation that there'd been at the time of the Southport stabbings. And it was the same police force, so I'm assuming that they learnt the lesson from last time.
Like a safe assumption.
Jo Tanner, well known around here, she's going to be joining me to talk through today's big stories. And we're also going to examine this new body that's been set up, supported by Israel and the United States, to distribute aid in Gaza. It's got a lot of criticism already because this question about whether they are compromising on humanitarian principles.
Fascinating stories coming up with you, Carolyn. I mean, the story today we touched on earlier on. 800 lawyers, 800, including 2 Supreme Court justices, former Supreme Court justice, a whole welter of High Court judges, high cases in the Bar Council, all saying time for sanctions on Israel, even expulsion from the United Nations. I mean, the clamour gets louder just as the leadership of Israel digs in deeper. Absolutely extraordinary situation.
But we saw, didn't we, the Israeli response when you had the French, the British, the Canadians
Total defiance.
expressing criticism. So, this goes on and on.
Well, Caroline, great show coming up. Now I want to welcome, as promised, Molly Ball from the Wall Street Journal, a regular visitor, I'm happy to say, to this programme, and is now on the line. Molly, welcome.
Hello, happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday to you. Well, I just want to start with something we were talking about a bit earlier on here on the programme. I don't know if you managed to get a glimpse at King Charles opening the Canadian Parliament, and with some. Well, in within the realms of a royal state opening a parliament, there was quite pointed the references, Molly, to self-determination, global trade, and other things too, which were clearly written, yes, admittedly written by the office of the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, but it was pointed stuff. Did that make any impression where you are?
Yeah, it was absolutely noticed. I think that aspect of it was noticed. There's also been a sort of goodwill delegation, a bipartisan delegation of senators there from the United States at the same time. And they are also aiming to get the message across that they are not on the same page as Trump when it comes to his sort of perplexing war on the Canadians. It's been interesting to watch, since Carney came back into office, he's gotten along quite a lot better with Trump than his predecessor, and that has raised hopes that there's a potential for some kind of breakthrough. Yes. But we haven't seen anything actually move yet. So I think the question is going to be, we know that Trump is always interested in the royals and what they think. But does he view this as some sort of like an escalation, or is he more favorably disposed upon hearing?
I mean, we do know, I think, that Donald Trump is very keen on the royal family. No doubt looking forward to his visit to this country. I think in the autumn, around September, is the date that's been discussed. Yes, he loves the royal family, but he's also got a famously thin skin. And I know we can't answer this question, but did any of that penetrate the thin skin, do you imagine, Molly?
I think that's the question, is, you never know with Trump how he's going to take things, and assertions of strength he sometimes views with respect, and he sometimes views, as you say, as an insult or a provocation or something that will cause him to counterpunch in the opposite direction. And we have not gotten any kind of readout from the White House so far as to whether and how Trump took notice of the King's remarks here.
I'm interested to hear the answer if the question is put.
I wonder if he ever even thinks what Charles really thinks about him, because I don't know what people around this table think, but I imagine Charles isn't a great fan of Donald Trump. Every instinct in me says that Charles isn't a great fan of Trump on whole issues, from the environment to just general manners. And I wonder, is Trump maybe just such a narcissist that he's never even thought about what does Trump really actually think of me?
Yes. I mean, and they've got the visit, which I think is going to be to Balmoral Castle around September. It's often described as a state visit. Now, occasionally I still make contact with people I used to talk to down Westminster way, and last I heard, pretty authoritatively, was that it's not a state visit. He's going to be coming, but it's not a state visit. So that means no carriages up the Mall. He's not going to be addressing both houses of Parliament. He's going to be having tea with the King, and that's quite an important distinction. I mean, are you picking up thoughts on that?
Well, I've been picking up concerns about protest, and obviously the bigger and showier and more of a spectacle the visit is, the more opportunities there are for protests that could cause let's go for the word embarrassment, and make it harder for the UK government to continue with the relationship in the way that they're trying to.
There's no way you're going to have a state address to Parliament, I don't think, because there'll be a Green, or there'll be an SNP, or there'll be someone
boycott.
Yeah, there'll be someone will walk out and cause a kerfuffle, which he will hate. And the last thing Keir Starmer wants is for Trump to remember the visit to the UK somehow being soiled or spoilt by that sort of protest.
Yes.
So I imagine it's going to be incredibly carefully managed.
Yeah. But maybe we shouldn't be talking about it in this terms, because what we want is for him to think it's the most glorious, highest honour of a visit that ever was, the best, the biggest, whatever. And it's only it's a lower tier visit if you talk to Parliament. The best thing you can do is have tea at Balmoral and hype it up in that way. That's what we want. We want the limited opportunities for any kind of embarrassment or disruption.
I like the fact,
maximum ego.
I like the fact you think he listens to Pienaar and Friends.
Of course he listens to Pienaar and Friends.
We know that he
doesn't he, Molly?
He does. Molly, which well known.
That was my thought exactly. Is that you never know. He might be listening right now, and we'd better spin this right.
Well, you know that. And actually, even as we speak, almost every evening, there's a stream of texts to us from
capitals
from President Trump. I mean, generally, I just don't bother to read them out. They just keep on flooding in.
Are they all in capital letters?
Yeah, some of them. When he feels strongly. That said, I mean, cucumber sandwiches at Balmoral Castle, that is still quite an honour, and it will be possible to helicopter in to the grounds of Balmoral and helicopter off to a golf club in Aberdeen without too much fuss. And Molly, just as I think the president is going to enjoy, the honour of sandwiches with the king, he would hate demonstrations, wouldn't he?
Oh, he's pretty accustomed to that. I think everywhere he goes in the United States, there are protests and demonstrations, and unless they actually stop the car from moving, which they tend not to, I think he's able to disregard it pretty easily.
Thin skin, maybe not quite that thin. What to talk about here on Pienaar and Friends with Rachel Cunliffe, Tim Montgomerie, and Molly Ball from the Wall Street Journal on the line there from the USA. And this is Times Radio.
At Aberdeen.
On Pienaar and Friends, Rachel Cunliffe from the Statesman, Tim Montgomerie, and Molly Ball from the Wall Street Journal. Molly, I'm keen to get your thoughts on the story of the war in Ukraine, because we've been watching, haven't we, to see how is the president going to react to what has been yet another night of a record volume of drone attacks into Ukraine overnight, as it was the night before that. No sign of the president backing up some of that tough language, Putin being crazy and so on, with action by way of tougher sanctions. And then I read in your paper a letter from Lindsey Graham, the United States Senator from South Carolina, who has this measure down on the table in Congress to impose really tough sanctions against Russia, 500% on imports from countries doing business with Russia, which would, by the way, conceivably include China. But what do we see in that letter from Lindsey Graham? That he's not acting on it, that he's waiting to see whether Putin comes round and sees the light and comes to the negotiating table. He's hoping for the best, he says, which sort of disarms some of the threat that had been hanging in the air, Molly, doesn't it?
Well, I think there are a lot of people around Trump, and I would consider Senator Graham to be one of them, who are eager to encourage this new tendency of his to see Putin as the aggressor, because they do see it as an encouraging development, even if it has not yet borne fruit in the form of executive action. We see Trump truthing just this morning, saying, he's the best thing going for Putin, and Putin had better acknowledge that fact. Yes. So he's moving slowly in the direction, but as you say, it has been all bark, no bite so far. And so I think, the Senate is not in session this week. We don't really know what the fate of that sanctions bill is, because it's bottled up behind some other things. But clearly there is a desire to just continue sort of gingerly pushing Trump in this direction and hope that he continues to learn what most people in the foreign policy community have known for many years, which is that, to Trump's surprise, he is suddenly beginning to understand that maybe Putin is not the peacemaker in this whole deal.
But the reluctance to act is just becoming so inescapably apparent. I was talking earlier on here on the show to a former US ambassador to Ukraine. He was raising the possibility that the president would, as it were, let Congress off the leash and let them take action down the route of tougher sanctions on their own initiative, as it were, without him at least getting in the way. Now, leave aside the question for the moment that it's not the business of Congress to be on the leash of the president. But again, I mean, do you see that as a possibility? Is it a pure guessing game to which we cannot know, Molly, in your view, or how do you see it playing out?
Well, we don't know. I mean, we've reported that this is something that Trump is considering, but until it happens, I think we and everyone are sort of understandably reluctant to read the tea leaves, just because they have gone in so many different directions over the course of, Trump's attitude toward this drama. And because expectations for Trump's dealings with Putin started out so low, because there were so many, I think, who believed that he was ready to simply give away the store from the beginning, they have wanted to sort of encourage any moves in the direction of being tougher on Russia and hope that Trump continues to sort of move in that direction.
Yes.
But Trump is going to do what Trump's going to do. I think everybody around him knows that. And if he were to, as you say, sort of give permission to Congress to do this in his stead, I don't think we would fool anyone into thinking that it was sort of not his idea. So everyone is still sort of waiting and watching for the president to give a signal.
So interesting, Molly, though, that I don't know what the exact number is. It was over 70, wasn't it, in the Senate, who were ready to line up behind this measure to impose these tough sanctions, and these were on both sides of the aisle. That's a lot of Republicans in that number. So there are clearly a lot of them there who aren't completely ready to toe the line for Trump. We'll see whether they, how it develops. But that was interesting in itself, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it is a sign that particularly when it comes to this conflict, you do have a large portion of the Republican Party that wants Trump to be tougher on Putin, that wants him to take a stronger hand toward this conflict. And if he is going to try to negotiate something not merely force the Ukrainians to sacrifice, which has been the fear. So the amount of co-sponsors on that bill are a sign that it is Republicans and Democrats both trying to push him in this direction. I don't know if that means that they're actually ready to act, but they're trying to make it look as though they are.
Tim?
Molly, I've sort of been mainly focusing on UK polling recently, and I've noticed Trump's own popularity has been dipping, but some sort of friends who I was talking to recently were saying that the polling for mid-term Republican candidates is abysmal. And I just wonder whether we're beginning, how much you're picking up from Republican candidates who are up for election next year, how much they are worried about just being associated with Trump. And actually, they're now going to be looking to make votes in the House of Representatives or Senate where they can say, I didn't back Trump all the time. I was an independent-minded person. Will we begin to see that pattern more and more, do you think?
Well, I think you misunderstand the dynamic in the legislative chamber in that there is no legislation for them to vote for or against Trump because they have been working on a single bill all year. And it is the one bill, the one big beautiful bill, as it is now officially called, that Trump wants him to pass.
But like on the sanctions issues we've just been discussing.
Sure. When and if it gets to that point, we'll see. I think the kinds of things that vulnerable Republicans would be more anxious to distinguish themselves on might have more to do with domestic policy. But you're right. This midterm discussion is absolutely becoming ripe right at this moment because the House and Senate are about to finally get this big beautiful bill over the finish line. And you do see, there is still a feeling, I think, even among the so-called frontliners, those in the most vulnerable districts, and there aren't very many of them, that they're still better off sticking with Trump than not, simply because they're going to need his base to come to the polls in the midterms, as well as they might need those swing voters. But this is the conversation that is just starting to be had here because this legislation is just finishing up. We're starting to hear Democrats and Republicans stake out their positions on this tax policy and start to make the case to voters. So this is just getting underway. And I think that both sides view the policy in question here, the tax policy, as the main thing they're going to be fighting over, because however it is that Trump is doing is sort of baked in. The Democrats are counting on a certain amount of anti-Trump backlash, but it's going to be them fighting over the details of this policy that is sort of going to make those contours come into view, I think.
Rachel.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the Democrats, actually, and national security. And I think Tim makes an interesting point about how the Republicans are reacting to all of this. I know the Democrats have been in a bit of a tailspin, and it only seems to be getting worse for them. But are there any efforts for the Democrats to kind of retake the patriotic, pro-national security, anti-dictator against American interests side? And can you see that effort emerging, or are they still just chasing their tails?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, of course, it is a line that you hear from Democrats, but I think there is a feeling that, that this is not going to be the central issue of the midterms. If there is a national security aspect to the Democrats' message, I think it's much more likely to focus on things like Trump's cuts to the Veterans Administration and making the argument that because of the chainsaw that Elon Musk has taken to the federal government, that these types of actions are hurting veterans and hurting national security. Things like the hijinks that we've seen from the defense secretary and the signal chats and some of the turmoil in the national security apparatus. But things like, whether and how we are to settle the war in Ukraine are pretty distant from the minds of American swing voters, particularly in a midterm election. There's a feeling like that whoever was going to vote specifically on that issue has probably already made up their mind, because the contours of that I don't think cleave, because Trump hasn't actually come out in favor of Putin's side in the war. Both sides are claiming that they are the ones who are better off to deliver security for the European continent and so forth.
Molly, it's always lovely to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us on the show this evening. It's just after 5 to 7, and frankly I'm starting to get a bit hungry, so I want to talk about food now just for the last few moments. I really caught my story in the Times today. It was about, a coming apocalypse. And the angle on the coming apocalypse, assuming it comes, let's hope it doesn't, is that there wouldn't be enough food provision for vegans, as well as for those Muslims who use halal food. And I just wonder, that's really potentially really quite worrying. Quite apart from the question of an apocalypse being quite worrying, the thought of not having the right food to eat during an apocalypse just makes the whole thing seem rather worse, doesn't it, Rachel?
Everything about this story is terrifying. So I have chronic anxiety, and any story about post-apocalyptical planning, preppers and all of that. Do you remember just before the election when the Conservatives put out a thing about how we needed sort of a week's supplies of bottled water and non-perishable food? And it terrifies me. And I don't think my husband really helps with this, because he's we have a first aid kit, candles and a wind-up generator torch in the kitchen at all times. And I'm like, we live in North London. Like, if we're in trouble, then a couple of candles are not going to get us through it. The situation is going to be so dire. But I thought the food thing was interesting. My number one concern actually would not be, do the vegans and the vegetarians get the food that they need? It's going to be, is the food non-perishable? And I would... I'm not an expert on this, but I would suggest that meat is one of the things that goes off quickest, meat and dairy. So actually you'd probably want more vegan food because it would last longer, and we might be in it for the long haul. But that's my anxious brain at work.
Well, there's tins of corned beef. That's part of the answer to that, I suppose. But, you've got the logistics of moving around tins of corned beef everywhere. And spam, good, wonderful, traditional wartime food, spam. I mean, are you a vegetarian, Tim, by any chance?
Did you think I am a vegetarian?
Well, as I guess I'd say no.
Tim had a go at me on this programme a couple of weeks ago for liking almond milk. You said it was woke milk.
That's right. Well, that's reform policy to believe that almond milk is woke. And
they'd ban it, wouldn't they?
Probably would, yeah. Probably would, yeah.
I tell you what, it lasts longer in the fridge.
Maybe.
If you want an apocalypse.
I thought when you were going to talk about the food story that struck me most in the Times today was that the French have stopped eating cheese. Did you see that?
I did not see
that. Only a small minority, but apparently young French people are eating much less cheese than adult French people.
That's an awful thought.
Well, I don't eat
what's
cheese.
Wrong with them?
I don't eat cheese at all. I hate cheese.
That's very woke. That's very... So you have a go at me for almond milk and you don't eat cheese. What's wrong with cheese?
I don't like it. And I don't like coffee either. I don't like coffee and I don't like cheese. Those are my two eccentricities when it comes to diet. But all I can say is I'm very glad. I live in Salisbury near Porton Down, which of course is the place, with people who don't know, is where all the biochemicals are manufactured and assessed. And I'm very hopeful if there is an apocalypse, a nuclear missile will take me out very quickly. I do not want to live in the post-apocalyptic world. I want to be taken out by nuclear attack straight away, because I think I would be rubbish at surviving in the post-apocalyptic. I can't even say it, let alone live in it.
You're not a kind of eat what you kill kind of type.
If we're going to live in a world where we don't have all the creature comforts that we people in the West are used to, I don't want to live in that world.
You'd be useless in an action movie there.
Oh yeah, I would be. I completely would be useless. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I thought. You
don't want to be on your own with me in a jungle.
I thought Reform prided itself in being full of members who could handle themselves in an apocalypse.
I'm not one of those.
I think I'd be okay with eating strange things. I've eaten locusts before, and I've eaten snake. So I think I'd be all right.
Yes.
Perhaps you're more reformed than I am.
But I wouldn't be able to kill it, hunt it, cook it, but I would be able to eat it.
I've eaten chocolate-covered ants. Well, that's another story for another time. We have to go. Rachel and Tim, great to have you. Thank you for listening. Our producer was Ollie Cole. Joe Lynham was our technical operator, and Karen's up next. Looking forward to that here on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the times.
Thanks very much, John. It's 7 o'clock. This is the evening edition with Carolyn Quinn sitting in tonight for Kate Borsay. Coming up, Nigel Farage pitches Reform UK as the party of the family and of hard-working people. He offers more generous tax breaks for married people and says he'd scrap the two-child benefit limit to make things easier for lower-paid workers. But how will that pitch go down with voters? And how will Reform pay for their promises? We'll be looking into that tonight. We bring you the latest from Liverpool as the authorities and community continue to absorb the horror of last night's parade crash. Aid deliveries in Gaza, they're happening, but the new method adopted by the Israelis is facing fierce criticism. We hear why and what it means for the thousands of Palestinians still starving. Later, King Charles is in Canada, a visit seen as reinforcing the sovereignty of the nation in the face of threatened annexation by Donald Trump.
Every time I come to Canada, a little more of Canada seeps into my bloodstream, and from there straight to my heart.
And later, the French are turning their noses up at smelly cheeses. Why? All that and our usual peek inside tomorrow's paper after the news with Laura Cook.
Thank you. Good evening. Police say they're questioning a man on suspicion of attempted murder as 11 people